He was never supposed to matter. He belonged to the old world, the one already buried under the weight of goodbye. His name was stitched to the same memories that were supposed to stay folded away. Yet there he was, in the middle of an ordinary afternoon, standing at the edge of something neither of us meant to start. The first time our eyes met after everything ended, it was strange. Familiarity without comfort. He smiled like he wasn't sure if he was allowed to, and for a moment, the past flickered. Faces, arguments, laughter that once belonged elsewhere. The silence between us was heavy, thick with everything we didn't say. But he didn't look away, and somehow, that steadiness broke through the awkwardness that hung in the air. He didn't ask about what happened, didn't mention the name that used to connect us. Instead, he talked about small things, weather, work, plans. Every word carefully chosen, gentle. It was almost as if he knew that certain subjects were off-limits, that some wounds still breathed beneath the surface. His voice carried patience, the kind that comes from someone who has learned to live with ghosts. It started with coincidence, bumping into each other in places that felt too small for chance. A grocery store aisle, a late-night cafe, a friend's gathering. Every time he lingered a little longer, the conversations stretching further than they should have. What began as polite small talk slowly turned into something deeper, like two people rediscovering a language they didn't realize they both spoke. There was no flirtation at first, just a quiet recognition, a shared understanding of what it means to have loved and lost. He didn't try to fill the silence. He honored it. That's what made it different. Most people speak to be heard. He spoke to understand, and in that difference, something fragile began to grow. It wasn't safe. Not at first. The thought of being seen by someone who had known the past was unbearable. It felt like exposure, like standing in front of a mirror that remembered everything you'd rather forget. But he never used that knowledge against me. He didn't treat the past like a story to analyze. He treated it like a fact, real but no longer defining. Over time, his presence became something like calm. When the mind spiraled into old memories, his voice was the steady reminder that the present still existed. When the air felt too heavy to breathe, his laughter made it light again. He carried his own kind of sadness, but it didn't weigh down the room. It shaped his gentleness, his restraint. One evening, he showed up at the cafe where I often sat alone. It was raining outside, the kind of soft rain that makes the city blur. He didn't ask to sit down. He just waited for a nod. The quiet between us was different that night, comfortable, filled with everything words couldn't carry. When he finally spoke, it wasn't a question. It was a confession without confession. "It's strange," he said softly, "how peace can feel dangerous when you're not used to it." That sentence stayed long after the rain stopped. It was true. Peace felt unfamiliar, almost threatening, like standing in the sunlight after years underground. But that was what being around him felt like, unsettling in its gentleness. There were no games, no expectations, no hidden edges, just presence. He remembered small things no one else did. How coffee should never be too bitter. How silence could say more than comfort ever could. He never pushed, never demanded, but he noticed everything. The way hands trembled slightly when certain names were mentioned. The way laughter sometimes carried a hint of apology. He saw it all and never asked for explanation. The past, once heavy, started to lose its sharpness. Not because it was erased, but because he stood beside it without fear. There's something healing about being known without being judged. It turns shame into memory, and memory into something survivable. There came a night when everything shifted. A small gathering with mutual friends, dim lights, too much wine, and the warmth of easy conversation. He was across the room, watching but not intruding. When the music faded and everyone else had gone, he offered to walk me home. The street was quiet, the kind of quiet that holds its breath. We walked side by side, not touching, but close enough to feel the gravity between us. Every step carried a question neither dared to ask. When we reached the door, he paused. The world seemed to narrow to the sound of rain dripping from the awning and the space between two heartbeats. He didn't move closer, didn't reach out. He just said, "You don't have to keep running from what's already forgiven." It wasn't about love in that moment. It was about truth. The truth that forgiveness doesn't always come from others. Sometimes it comes from being seen by someone who knows your story and still chooses to stay. After that night, nothing was official, yet everything had changed. We didn't speak of the past anymore. We built something new, quiet and real. It wasn't about starting over. It was about continuing, this time without pretending. He never tried to take the place of what came before. He didn't need to. He simply became part of what came after. The part where healing looked like laughter again, where love sounded less like promises and more like presence. There were still moments of hesitation, flashes of guilt for feeling something that once would have been considered wrong. But love has a way of rewriting its own rules. What mattered wasn't where we came from, but who we had become. Two people who had seen too much of heartbreak to mistake gentleness for weakness. Two souls who had been broken differently, yet healed in rhythm. He wasn't supposed to matter. But he did. Not because he replaced the past, but because he saw through it. And in that recognition, love found its way back. Not loud, not rushed, just real. He never asked questions that scraped at old wounds. There was no interrogation, no probing curiosity disguised as care. He simply listened, really listened, until words stopped shaking under their own weight. That was how it began, not with confession, but with permission to exist without defense. Some connections announced themselves with thunder. This one arrived like breath after drowning, quiet, necessary, unplanned. His presence carried calm, the kind born from knowing chaos intimately and refusing to add to it. Conversations unfolded slowly, like a book you didn't realize you were writing together. Every pause held safety, every glance an understanding. There was no need to decorate pain or make it poetic. With him, truth didn't have to be beautiful to be believed. It could just be. Sometimes silence was the language we both spoke best. He could sit for hours beside unspoken things, not asking them to resolve, just acknowledging they were there. There's a rare kind of peace that happens when someone doesn't need to be entertained or reassured, when they simply stay. That's what he did. Stayed. Through quiet nights and unkind days, he made no demands, offered no solutions, and somehow, that made everything less unbearable. It's strange how care can slip through unnoticed at first. How it hides in ordinary gestures. A message sent at the right time, a seat left open, a shared song. But when kindness isn't performative, it changes everything it touches. His care felt like that. It wasn't loud or decorated with words like always or forever. It just existed, honest and steady. One evening, the conversation drifted into memory. Not on purpose, but the way truth sometimes sneaks in when the air is soft. I remember saying something about failure, about the kind of love that leaves you doubting your own worth. He didn't interrupt, didn't try to fix it with cliches or easy comforts. He just nodded, a small movement that said more than words could. Then, after a while, he said, "Sometimes what breaks you also teaches you how to hold something right." That sentence stayed. It followed me like a shadow for days, maybe because it came from someone who had lived it. His own heartbreak wasn't a rumor or a metaphor. It was a lived-in room he still carried the scent of. And that's what made it safe. His pain didn't compete with mine. It understood it. Two people learning quietly that recognition can heal what repair cannot. There was a moment, small, almost forgettable, that changed everything. A laugh unguarded and real? I don't even remember what started it, but it filled the room like light, dissolving whatever was left of the old distance. It wasn't romantic then. It was human. It was the sound of trust returning after being gone too long. After that, it became easier. Not easy, just easier. Words began to flow without fear of being misunderstood. He never misused them, never twisted vulnerability into invitation or weakness. The more he listened, the more the heart dared to speak. He would say things like, "You don't have to be strong all the time." Or, "It's okay if you still miss what hurt you. That's how the body remembers." His voice carried something sacred, not softness for the sake of comfort, but truth delivered gently enough to be heard. There was no official beginning, no clear moment when friendship became something else. It simply shifted, the way a tide does. Quietly, then completely. The first touch wasn't planned. It wasn't even meant to be one. Just a hand brushing against another, a small accident that lingered too long to be nothing. The world seemed to pause in that second, not in shock but in recognition. As if everything that had been held back had finally found its name. After that, the air between us changed. Still respectful, still careful, but charged. We didn't rush it. Maybe because both of us knew what rushing had cost before. Love born from wounds doesn't crave intensity. It craves safety. And this was that. A slow unfolding, a steady warmth that replaced the ache of being unseen. He never once asked to be chosen. He just kept showing up until it felt impossible to imagine a day without him. That was the magic, not in the grand gestures but in the consistency. Love didn't arrive with fireworks. It came with quiet mornings, honest words, and the comfort of knowing someone finally saw you. Not the mask, not the scars, you. There were nights when memory tried to rewrite the story, when guilt whispered that this connection shouldn't exist, that he was too close to the past, too tangled in what used to be. But he never let shame stay long. "We're not who we were back then," he'd say, "and maybe that's the point." He understood that love wasn't about replacing what was lost. It was about recognizing what had survived. The unspoken understanding between us wasn't built on desire alone. It was built on knowing, the kind that doesn't need to be explained because it's felt in every pause, every look, every breath shared in silence. One night, under the soft hum of the streetlights, he said quietly, "I see you." Not as a phrase, not as flattery, but as truth. It wasn't about eyes or bodies or history. It was about presence, the kind that doesn't demand or define. It just exists, complete. Love found its way in without warning. Not loud, not reckless. It arrived like forgiveness, slow, tender, inevitable. It didn't fix what was broken. It didn't erase the past. It simply held it, gently, until it stopped hurting to remember. And that was enough. Because sometimes love doesn't need to be declared. Sometimes it just needs to be understood. It didn't arrive like lightning. It gathered the way summer heat gathers before rain, slow, patient, inevitable. A glance began to linger longer than manners allow, and the smallest laughter started repairing something silent and sore. Friendship had been the promise, a safe shore after a shipwreck. Then the air thickened with an honesty that didn't ask to be justified, only felt. Days learned a softer rhythm. Conversations kept their ordinary clothes, errands, music, the weather's indecision, but tone betrayed a deeper current. Words no longer traveled alone. They carried warmth the way hands carry tea in winter, a message sent late, not for attention but to keep a lonely hour from swallowing its own echo. A call that never asked for answers, only offered time. Gratitude took its seat quietly at first, then pulled the chair closer. Kindness drew a map the body trusted before the mind agreed. Doors held open, not showy, simply natural. Small, precise remembering, a preferred coffee, the way quiet is needed after crowded rooms, the tiny flinch when a certain song begins. Nothing was demanded. Presence did the heavy lifting. This is how fire learns to begin without burning anything down. Tinder of consistency, a match struck by recognition, a flame cupped carefully from the wind. The past pressed its face to the window sometimes, fogging the glass with old names and old rules. He did not wipe it away. He let it clear on its own. That restraint turned backbone into a verb. Control did not feel like distance. It felt like care, the kind that guards dignity while desire learns a safer language. Nights stretched longer, full of small rituals. A table set with 2 plates even when appetite was unsure. Music low enough for the heart to keep time with it. Stories told in fragments, as if the mouth were a cautious archivist choosing which files the light could see. No testimony required. Truth arrived on tiptoe and found a seat. When laughter escaped, unguarded, bright, something inside decided to live a little louder. Touch began where words left off. Not in grand gestures, but in careful proximities, shoulders almost brushing on a walk that did not hurry, hands meeting over a bowl as if the spoon were an excuse, knees angled toward one another at the end of a long couch where the day came to rest. The first contact was accidental by design, the kind of accident patience plans. Fingers grazed and did not apologize. Breath paused, not from fear, from recognizing a door and deciding together not to slam it. Friends noticed the ease before either admitted the shift. They teased kindly. The calendar answered with more shared squares. Errands became adventures. Even grocery aisles turned conspiratorial. The ridiculous price of berries, the tenderness of choosing peaches that would ripen at the same pace as courage. The ordinary grew radiant because company made room for it to matter. Silence ceased being a test and became a home. Whole minutes held without speech, not empty, full, of safety, of the unspectacular miracle of not performing. He knew how to let quiet breathe. He knew how to place a sentence gently on its back and wait for it to fall asleep. In that roominess, the heart stopped bracing. Shoulders discovered their own natural height again. Memory still had teeth. On certain evenings, it bit down without warning. A song at the cafe, a jacket on a chair that looked too much like the old winter. He learned the choreography of steadiness for such moments. Kettle on, lamp low, a hand offered to the edge of the table rather than the edge of the person. Permission to step outside and return. Agreement that return would not be timed. The past grew less frightening not because it was defeated, but because it was not faced alone. Spring arrived rebellious and wet. Walks took on puddles and new greens. In a park where magnolias performed their brief opera, a confession happened without the word confession ever showing up. Not a speech, an accumulation. Compliments that landed carefully, like birds who have learned which branches won't break. Humor that dared a little more, bold enough to touch joy without apologizing. The body answered before the mouth, softening in the places vigilance used to guard, trusting the nearness it had measured for so long. Fire has many temperatures. There was a heat that asked nothing but presence, warming palm to palm, slowing time at the wrist. Under lamplight, eyes learned a new consistency. Not darting away, not pinning, simply staying. That staying said more than any claim could. It said this is not a robbery, this is shared shelter. It said the door is open and no one will be carried across it who does not choose. Boundaries did not vanish. They were honored into intimacy. The world beyond had opinions. The heart answered with practice, not argument. Plans were made that did not trespass. Kindness was chosen over drama with a regularity that became its own intoxication. Even longing learned patience. Want was not a wolf. It was a stove, steady flame under a pot that would not scorch what it meant to nourish. There came a day made of small light, laundry on a line, late breakfast, a stubborn window finally yielding to a firm, gentle push. He read aloud a sentence that did not need reading aloud. It just sounded better that way. The laugh that followed tuned the room. Hands found each other without ceremony. This was not the fireworks they warn about. This was a hearth. The kind of heat you can live beside for a lifetime. Friends, those who loved both past and present, asked if this felt complicated. The answer, told in smiles more than syllables, was that complication had been traded for clarity. Not ease, choices still had edges, but clarity that arrived from the question always answered the same way. Does this make the world kinder for us and the people we owe gentleness to? Yes? Continue. No? Try again. That rubric turned guilt into a ghost that visited less and less. On an ordinary Tuesday, a storm rolled in early, sky bruised before noon. Power blinked, then returned. Dinner was improvised, bread sliced too thick, tomatoes reckless with their juice. basil torn by hand, not ceremony. Music climbed the walls, soft percussion like rain's older cousin. The first kiss chose that unlikely moment. Not because of timing, because of truth. It didn't arrive to conquer. It arrived to agree. The body answered not with fireworks, but with relief. The kind that shivers once and then grows very, very calm. After, the room did not tilt. The floor remained faithful. The world outside continued its ordinary miracle of bus routes and night shifts. Inside, something rearranged itself into a new rightness. There was no scramble to define, no fever for labels. Names would come when names felt like gratitude instead of cages. For now, everything important was already understood in the way breath met breath without taking more than it gave. The past still sent postcards. Faded scenes, sharp corners. They were read, set down, sometimes laughed at gently, sometimes held in both hands until the paper warmed. History had its seat at the table, but no longer demanded the head of it. Redemption looked less like erasing and more like hosting. Thank you for what you taught. There is new conversation now. The fire grew wiser rather than wilder. It learned the discipline of banked coals, the art of lasting through weather. Workdays were met, families respected, the future discussed without flinching. Dreams were not declarations. They were garden markers. Here we might plant travel. Here, a shared room of books. Here, the stubborn hope of a dog who would insist on walks even when rain argued otherwise. Not every hour glittered. There were misunderstandings, the old instincts that reached for armor too quickly. The days when tenderness felt like risk, and each returned to separate corners to remember courage. Apologies became bridges rather than trials. Forgiveness was practiced in the small, so it would be fluent when the large arrived. This made the fire honest. It burned through pretense first. A final test appeared in the simplest form. An invitation from the past dressed as obligation. Attending would be correct. Attending together would be truthful. The decision took 2 late-night conversations, 1 quiet drive, and a shared vow to let the room read whatever story it needed to read, while the real one stayed steady between 2 hands. The evening came. Eyes followed. History rustled its scripts. And then, nothing dramatic, only decency. Courtesy exchanged, boundaries kept, a grace that was neither timid nor cruel. Leaving felt like finishing a long book and closing it with thanks. The night air outside smelled new. After that, a peace arrived that did not need explanation. The friendship had not been abandoned. It had been fulfilled. The fire did not erase what built it. It warmed it into context. Trust grew roots that would rather hold than prove. The body no longer mistook adrenaline for love. The heart no longer mistook silence for danger. It wasn't sudden. It was slow, patient, inevitable. A glance learning to stay, a laugh choosing to heal, the air thickening with a truth that lived without permission slips or applause. What began as careful companionship became the kind of warmth that refuses to scorch, the kind that makes a life livable. The moment friendship turned into fire was not a fall. It was a homecoming. The love that formed didn't erase history, it rewrote it. What began as a fragile friendship was never meant to heal what was broken, only to sit beside it long enough for breathing to return. It wasn't about betrayal. It was about recognition. The strange mercy of being seen by someone who knew the version of you that didn't survive, and still chose to stay for the one that did. The first real shift came in a moment that shouldn't have mattered. It was small, accidental, quiet. A forgotten book on a table, a half-finished cup of coffee, his hand brushing past to set something down. Nothing profound, nothing planned. But something in that ordinary gesture felt like forgiveness in motion. Not dramatic, not spoken, just there. A softness that reached places words never could. He knew the history, of course. The names, the mess, the mistakes. He'd lived close enough to the ruins to know where the sharp edges still were. But he never stepped clumsily through them. He moved with the kind of care that says, I know where it hurts, and I'm not here to make it hurt again. That was the beginning of trust. Quiet, slow, deliberate. Not the kind you offer, but the kind you grow into because someone makes it safe to. There were still moments when the past demanded to be remembered. Nights when the mind replayed arguments like old films, when laughter from another time echoed in empty rooms. He never told me to forget. He never tried to compete with ghosts. Instead, he reminded me that they didn't own the whole story anymore. "What you lived," he once said softly, "doesn't make this less real. It just makes it more honest." And somehow that made it easier to breathe. We talked about everything and nothing. That's how it often happens, with people who arrive when you've stopped expecting anyone to. There were stories about work, random songs that lingered too long, conversations about fear disguised as jokes. But beneath every exchange was a pulse, something alive, something that kept finding its way back no matter how carefully we tried to bury it. One evening, the world seemed to shrink to the space between two breaths. Rain outside, candles flickering low, words running out. He looked at me, not with the curiosity of someone discovering, but with the understanding of someone remembering. As if all the years between then and now were a bridge, and we had finally stepped onto the same side. The air held its breath, and in that stillness, I felt it, the strange peace that comes when two stories once fractured start to rhyme again. It would have been easy to call it wrong, to pull back, to hide behind reason. There were enough rules, enough history to justify running. But love, real love, doesn't ask for permission. It recognizes itself. And in that recognition, everything old began to lose its power. What was once a scar became proof of survival. What had once been pain became context for gentleness. He never asked for promises. He never needed them. He just kept showing up, in the small hours, in the laughter that felt new again, in the way silence stopped being something to fear. That was the difference. Love didn't demand. It restored. It didn't erase the hurt. It softened its echo. There came a moment, a simple one without pretense, when everything shifted from friendship into something wordless. A touch that lingered, a sigh that wasn't planned. The kind of closeness that didn't feel rushed or stolen, but inevitable. Not passion trying to consume, but connection finding its rightful place. It was both terrifying and holy, like standing at the edge of a familiar ocean, realizing you can finally step in without drowning. Days grew quieter after that. Not because the fire faded, but because peace took its place. There was no more pretending, no more trying to fit into someone else's idea of love. The world outside still whispered about lines and loyalty, but inside, something truer was unfolding. This wasn't about defiance, it was about becoming. About finding the courage to let love mean healing, not hiding. He never claimed to fix anything. He never tried to fill the spaces left by others. He simply met them, acknowledged them, and offered presence instead of repair. And that was what changed everything. Because real redemption doesn't come from erasing what happened. It comes from loving someone through it, and letting that love rewrite the ending. There was one night, near the end of summer, when we sat watching the sky go from gold to indigo. The air was still, the world in between seasons. He turned to me and said, "It doesn't feel like starting over anymore. It feels like coming home." It wasn't a grand declaration, but it was enough. Because home had stopped being a place or a promise. It had become a person, and in that quiet realization, every broken piece finally made sense. Love didn't fix the past. It didn't need to. It just taught it how to stop bleeding. If this story found a heartbeat inside yours, let it stay a while. Like, share, and subscribe. Not just for stories, but for the feeling of being seen. Here, love isn't fantasy. It's memory, it's healing, it's truth. Because every ending we tell here is really a beginning in disguise.